Real stories of werewolves, of dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
My mom had a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. We had multiple encounters with a real dogman in my family. The scariest time was when I heard him, rather than seeing him. You see, one moment I was dreaming, fragments of memories swirling behind closed eyes, and the next, I was awake, my room thick with smoke and heat pressing against my skin like a living thing. My father was already moving, his large hands grabbing my shoulder, shouting something I couldn't quite hear over the roar that seemed to be everywhere at once. The window to my left glowed orange, and heat radiated from the walls in waves that made the air shimmer and dance. But beneath the crackling of flames, beneath my father's urgent movements, there was something else. That haunting howl, rising and falling with a pitch that was neither fully animal, nor fully something else. Years later I would understand, but in that moment, there was only survival. We made it out, all of us. My mother was already on the front lawn, her nightgown billowing in the chill pre-dawn air, her hands clasped together as in prayer, but not quite. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line, where something large and dark moved just at the edge of vision. That something had called to us. It had awakened us. It had saved us. But its story, our story, began long before that night. I grew up in a small farmhouse nestled against the western slope of the Cascade foothills, where the forest pressed close and civilization felt like a distant memory. My mother was not like other women in our small community. She moved with grace, her hands always busy, her eyes always watching, not just us, but the world around her. My father was a logger, strong, quiet, the kind of man who believed in hard work and harder silences. He would leave before dawn and return after sunset, his boots caked with mud, his hands rough as tree bark. He loved us in his way, provided for us, protected us, but he was not a man of many words or deep observations. My mother was different. She noticed things, small things, the way the wind moved through the trees, the tracks that appeared near our chicken coop, not quite deer tracks and not quite wolf tracks either. The sounds that came from the forest on nights when the moon hung low and heavy. I was maybe 10 when I first realized something was different. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where mist hangs in the valleys and the world feels suspended between darkness and light. I watched my mother prepare a bundle, leftover chicken from the previous night's dinner, some bread, and a few strips of dried meat. She wrapped it carefully in brown paper, moving with a deliberateness that suggested this was a ritual, not a random act. Mom thought I was asleep, but I learned early to be quiet, to watch silently. When Mom slipped out the back door, I followed. Not immediately, not obviously. I knew how to move quietly through the woods. My father had taught me hunting after all. I knew how to place my feet. I knew how to move between the trees without breaking a single twig. The forest was alive around us, not threatening, but watchful, waiting. My mother moved with a certainty that suggested she had done this many times before. And then, in a small clearing where the morning light struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, I saw it. At first it was just a movement, a shape larger than a wolf but not quite a bear. Something that stood differently, moved differently. When it turned, I caught a glimpse. Fur that was more like rough hair. A posture that was nearly fully animal nor human. Eyes that reflected something ancient and something intelligent. My mother spoke softly, not words I could understand from the distance, but sounds, gentle sounds, sounds of offering of peace. And the creature accepted her offering. I would learn in the years that followed to keep this secret, not out of fear, but out of an understanding that some things are too profound, too delicate, to be exposed to the harsh light of everyday understanding. Our salvation would come years later. But that morning in the woods, something began. A connection. A friendship. A mystery that would define my entire life. I hadn't planned to follow her that morning. It was something that rose up in me suddenly. A curiosity that had been building for years, like water gathering behind a fragile dam. The pre-dawn light was more suggestion than reality. Gray shadows blending into deeper gray. The forest breathing around me with soft rustlings and whispers. My mother moved differently when she thought no one was watching. Her steps were deliberate, careful, each placement of her foot seeming to communicate something I couldn't quite understand. The bundle she carried, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, swung gently at her side. Scraps from our kitchen I knew. Bits of meat, a heel of bread, something that looked like soft cheese wrapped in cloth. I was no longer a child, but I was not quite a man. 16, with enough woodcraft to move silently, to blend into the landscape. My father had taught me hunting and tracking, skills that now served a different purpose entirely. The clearing came suddenly, a break in the dense forest where moonlight and early dawn fought for dominance. And there, how do I describe something that exists between reality and imagination? I saw something larger than a wolf. I saw something broader than a bear, covered in fur that wasn't quite fur, more like coarse hair that caught the light in strange ways. Upright but not entirely, moving with a grace that suggested intelligence beyond simple animal instinct. My mother approached this creature without fear. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual I was witnessing for the first time, but one that felt achingly familiar to her. She set down her bundle of food and took a step back. The creature, the dogman, though I hesitate to use a term that sounds so clinical, moved with a deliberateness that mirrored hers. Not threatening, but not submissive. Something else entirely. Something that suggested a relationship built on something deeper than words. I watched as it accepted her offering, not lunging, not rushing, but with a careful consideration that felt almost human. In that moment, I understood two things. First, that my mother had been doing this for years, that this was a secret I could never reveal. Not to my father, not to anyone. The years that followed were a delicate dance of silence and observation. I became an expert at noticing without seeing, at understanding without questioning. My mother's morning disappearances, the strange tracks near our chicken coop, the occasional distant howl that would drift through our windows on particularly quiet nights. My father remained oblivious, or if he noticed anything he chose not to speak of it like me. He was a man of action, not speculation. The forest was a place of work for him, of logging, of hunting, of survival, but not of mystery. But for my mother and me, the forest held something else entirely. I watched her change over those years, not dramatically, but there was a softness that came into her eyes, a quietness, as if she carried a profound secret that gave her both strength and peace. When she looked toward the tree line, there was something that went beyond mere affection, a connection, an understanding. There were moments of near discovery. The time my father almost followed her tracks one morning, the night a neighbor's dog went missing, and whispers began to circulate about wild animals in the forest. Each time, I found ways to redirect, to protect the secret that had become as much mine as hers. Not out of fear, but out of a profound respect for something I didn't fully understand. Our family continued, normal on the surface. My father went to work. I helped on the farm. My mother kept house, prepared meals, tended her small garden. And somewhere, in the vast green world beyond our cleared land, something watched. Something remembered the quiet offerings, the moments of connection. I learned to read the subtle signs, the way my mother would sometimes pause in her kitchen work listening, the brief smile that would cross her face when a distant sound, not quite a dog howl, but not quite anything else, would drift through our windows. A secret, a connection, a friendship that existed beyond the boundaries of what most would consider possible. And I was this secret's keeper? What connects two beings who cannot speak in words? Not language, certainly. Not the conventional understanding that binds most relationships. Something else. Something deeper. My mother's connection with the creature was like a language unto itself. Gestures, pauses, a particular way of moving through shared space. Years of observation taught me that their bond transcended anything I could easily explain. She never brought much. Simple offerings. Food scraps that would have gone to the chickens or been thrown away. A piece of cloth that had worn thin. Once I saw her leave a small ceramic cup, chipped but carefully cleaned, near the edge of the forest. Not a gift exactly, more like a communication, a reminder of something shared. The creature, I never really found a name that felt right for it, seemed to understand these moments with a profound sensitivity. It would approach carefully, not out of fear, but out of a kind of mutual respect. Sometimes it would sit, not touching the offering immediately, but watching, considering. I began to understand that this was not about survival. This was not about hunger. This was something else entirely. A connection that existed beyond practical needs. There were times I caught my mother studying photographs, old ones from before I was born. Her hands would trace the edges of these images with a gentleness that suggested memory. Memory of what I could never quite determine. Something in her eyes spoke of a history that predated my understanding. The forest seemed to hold its breath during these encounters. Birds would pause their singing. The wind would still. It was as if the entire world recognized that something profound was happening. I never saw aggression. I never saw anything that suggested threat. Just a careful, deliberate dance of two beings who found something in each other that defied explanation. My mother never spoke of it. Not to me, not to anyone as far as I know. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sunset and true darkness, I would catch her looking toward the tree line with a smile that held more history than I could comprehend. The summer of 1983 burned hot and dry, the kind of season that turned our fields into a box of matches and made the forest feel like a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. We had been careful. My father had cleared a wide border around our house, creating a firebreak that he believed would protect us from any potential wildfire. But some dangers aren't seen until they're already consuming everything in their path. That night began like any other. My sister Margaret was home from college, sleeping in her old bedroom. I was visiting for my job in the nearby town, helping my parents during the harvest season. My mother moved through the house with her usual quiet efficiency, checking windows, setting out water glasses, performing small rituals of evening that had defined our family for decades. I was asleep in my bedroom when the first hint of trouble came. The warmth that wasn't just summer heat. At first I thought nothing of it, but then, a smell. Smoke, but not from a distant campfire or a controlled burn. This was different. Then I heard the howling, and I sat up quickly. My father was the first to move. A logger's instincts are sharp, honed by years of working in unpredictable environments. "Everyone up," he shouted, his voice cutting through the night's stillness. "Fire! Fire!" The heat came next, not gradually but all at once, like walking into a wall of pure intense warmth. The wooden floors began to creak, not with age, but with the strain of intense heat. Margaret was crying. My father was trying to gather important documents. My mother was moving with a calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. And then, again, the howl. It wasn't like any sound I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf's howl. It wasn't an animal's cry of distress exactly. This was something else. A sound that seemed to carry both warning and protection. A sound that spoke of something ancient and watchful. My mother froze, not in fear, in recognition. The flames were moving faster than should have been possible. Our carefully maintained firebreak meant nothing against the speed and intensity of this blaze. The windows began to crack from the heat, spider-web lines spreading across the glass like broken memories. "We need to go," my father was saying, but his voice seemed distant. Margaret was clutching a photograph album, her hands shaking. I could see the fire now, not just feel it. It was moving through the house with a terrible purpose. It was consuming everything in its path. Another howl, even closer this time. My mother moved to the back door, not in panic or fear, but with a deliberateness that suggested she was following a plan long prepared. Her hand touched something, a small bundle wrapped in cloth that I'd seen her prepare countless times over the years. Now, she said, not a suggestion, a command. We moved as a unit. My father was carrying Margaret. I was supporting my mother. The heat was incredible, pressing against us like a living thing. Boards were collapsing. The roof was beginning to cave, and yet we found a clear path, a path that seemed almost guided. At the edge of the clearing I saw it, the shape I had glimpsed years ago in the pre-dawn woods, larger than a wolf, upright, watching. Its eyes reflected something that wasn't just animal intelligence, something that recognized us, something that had been watching over us for years. My mother dropped the small bundle she'd been carrying, an offering, not of fear, but of something deeper. We made it to safety moments before the entire house collapsed. Standing on the grass, watching our entire life burn, I understood something profound. The creature, the dogman, had been more than a secret, more than a mysterious presence in our lives. It had been our protector. My father was checking Margaret for injuries, calling neighbors, doing the practical things that needed to be done. But my mother stood slightly apart, her eyes fixed on the tree line where something large and dark was slowly retreating. No words were spoken. None were needed. We had survived. And something out there, had ensured that survival. Time does strange things to memory. What once seemed impossible becomes a delicate thread connecting past to present, mystery to understanding. I'm an old man now, sitting in a small house not far from where our family farm once stood. That same forest remains. It's changed, but it's unchanged. My sister Margaret passed on 3 years ago. My father decades earlier. My mother, the keeper of the greatest secret I've ever known, passed quietly in her sleep 22 years after the fire that consumed our home and revealed something extraordinary. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand. Not to explain, for some things defy explanation, but to honor the connection I witnessed, the memory that has lived with me longer than most of my other memories. In the years after the fire, we rebuilt. Not the same house, but a new one, closer to town, but still touching the edge of the forest that had been our companion and protector for so long. My father never spoke of that night. Not once. It was as if the fire had burned away not just our home, but any desire to question what had happened. But I watched, and I remembered. Sometimes in the early morning hours, I would see my mother standing at the window, not looking out exactly, but listening. There would be a moment, just a moment, when something would pass across her face, a recognition, a memory of something profound. I never asked her about the creature, not directly, but in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, I knew she carried a story that could never be fully told, a connection that existed beyond language, beyond understanding. Scientists would call it impossible. Researchers would demand more proof, but some truths are not meant to be dissected. Some mysteries are sacred. I've researched, of course, quietly, carefully, cryptozoology journals, local indigenous stories, whispered accounts from loggers and forest workers. Nothing concrete, nothing that would capture the essence of what I'd seen and what I knew. This dogman creature was not a monster. He was not a threat. He was something else entirely. He was a guardian, a presence that understood connection in a way most cannot comprehend. My mother's photographs, the ones saved from the fire, tell a story without words. A blurred edge here, a shadowy form there. Nothing definitive, but enough to remind me that some truths exist beyond proof. The forest still calls to me. Even now, in my 80s, I'll stand at the window in the pre-dawn light, listening, remembering. There are moments, brief, impossible moments, when I think I hear something. a distant howl, a movement at the tree line, a reminder. We are watched. We are protected in ways we cannot understand. My mother knew this. She had always known this. Her life contained a friendship that existed in the spaces between what we know and what we cannot comprehend. I am the last keeper of this story. When I am gone, it will become something else. A whisper. Maybe a story told around a campfire but dismissed as folklore. However, I know the truth. And the truth is, we are not alone in the woods.
He's a solid him, and he is no balker. I'm talking about Godzilla Tim Walker. Please join me in thanking one of our longest and most cherished channel members, Godzilla Tim Walker, for making this episode possible. Godzilla Tim is a $10 member. That means he gets to see the brand new secret uncensored episode called My Friend at Church is Becoming a Werewolf, which we dropped just last night. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online like the heroic and immortal Godzilla Tim Walker, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.